The lecture hall was silent, eerily so. You could hear the hum of the lights overhead and the faint static crackle of the holographic projector warming up behind the podium. Professor Luthor hadn't even begun the day's lecture, and yet every student, regardless of species or background, was already riveted to their seats. Some sat upright with stiff spines, others leaned forward, their appendages clutched nervously, and a few of the more gelatinous species simply rippled with barely contained anticipation or dread. Whatever the case, one thing was clear. No one had come to this class expecting what was about to be said. Then the professor spoke, and everything changed. "Humans," he said slowly, voice like a judge handing down a death sentence, "are walking war crimes, and that's why they're not allowed in our wars." The words rang out across the hall like a gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. Not a breath, not a breath. Even in a classroom that regularly discussed tactical orbital bombardments and the ethics of neutron implosions, this statement was something else entirely. It carried a weight that none of them were prepared to handle. Luthor let the silence stretch just long enough before speaking again. "Yes," he said, his voice tinged with both disgust and, oddly enough, a trace of reverence. "You've probably heard stories, exaggerated tales of human brutality, whispered accounts of their primitive, unregulated combat style. Most of you probably thought those stories were just propaganda or relics from an age of fear and misunderstanding. But I assure you," he paused, looking around the room, "the truth is worse, much worse." A few turned to glance at each other, as if silently asking whether this was all part of the curriculum or something darker. Luthor gestured, and the holographic display behind him flickered to life. The lights dimmed. A human soldier stood alone atop a ruined structure, rubble all around him. His armor was dented, patched with cloth and tape, his weapon crude by modern standards. He was covered in dirt and blood, and yet it wasn't any of that that drew attention. It was his eyes. That face did not belong to a soldier. It belonged to something else, something primal. "This image," Luthor said quietly, "was taken during the siege of Talvor, one of the last recorded conflicts humans participated in before the Bane. This man, this lone human, was responsible for the deaths of over 3,000 Scorn warriors. In a single night." Several students visibly recoiled. One of the creatures, with its 7 limbs and kaleidoscope eyes, clicked nervously. A Vosk, a towering reptilian species with armor-thick hide, actually leaned back, his brow furrowed with what might have been fear. Even a Zelek, whose jelly-like body rarely showed emotion, rippled with unmistakable unease. But it came from a young Vacon, a species with 4 arms, pale blue skin, and a reputation for meticulous logic. His hand trembled slightly as he lowered it, his voice unsure. "Humans are. How could one human possibly?" Luthor turned his head toward the student, his dark eyes narrowing, his tone clipped and sharp. "It is not their strength," he said, "that makes them dangerous. It's their minds." He tapped the controls, and another series of images appeared, this time showing the aftermath of Talvor. Scorn bodies lay strewn across the battlefield like discarded dolls, their enormous 9-foot frames bent and broken in unnatural angles. Pools of thick, dark blood soaked the earth. But what stood out more than the bodies were the traps, hundreds of them, pits filled with sharpened stakes, metal wires strung between shattered columns, rudimentary explosives fashioned from fuel cells and scavenged circuitry. There was nothing uniform or orderly about it. It was chaos. Improvised, desperate chaos. And it had worked. Just what he found. What he could build. He adapted, improvised. Even the younger students, many of whom had never heard of Talvor, stared at the images like they were watching a horror story unfold in real time. "You see," Luthor continued, now pacing slowly across the front of the hall, "humans don't follow rules, not when it comes to survival. They turn anything, everything, into a weapon. To them, War isn't just combat, it's a puzzle to solve. And when you put them in a corner, they don't crumble. And then they fight. The Rakash student, a lizard-like creature whose golden-green scales glinted softly in the dark, raised a clawed hand, his voice low and doubtful. "This is impossible," he said. "What kind of weapon did he use to kill 3,000 Scorn warriors? A trap can kill one, maybe 5, not thousands." Luthor shook his head. "No weapon," he said flatly. "Just a mind that refused to surrender. A mind that sees death not as a deterrent, but a challenge." He tapped again. The display shifted to tactical readouts from the siege. Diagrams of Scorn troop movements, casualty reports, heat maps of the battlefield. Each one told the same story. A massive, well-trained alien army, completely undone by a single man. "In the coalition," Luthor said, "our tactics are built on logic, efficiency, hierarchy. But humans, they anticipate your next move before you've even made it. They learn from every mistake. They never stop." A student in the back, an Iran with luminous tendrils pulsing softly, leaned forward, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But if they're so dangerous," he asked, "why haven't we destroyed them? Why let them live at all?" Luthor stopped moving. His jaw tightened. "Once, a long time ago, the Coalition considered it. But we learned something terrifying. The more you push them," he said slowly, "the more dangerous they become. Humans, they evolve. They become something else. Something for all." The screen behind him went dark. "You may think it unfair," Luthor continued, his tone softening slightly, "that we banned them from our wars, that we denied them a seat at the table. But tell me, what would you have done? Would you give that soldier another chance to improvise?" There was no answer. The professor looked around the room, his eyes lingering on each student. Some avoided his gaze. Others stared back with wide, haunted expressions. No one argued. Finally, he turned off the projector and sighed. "Remember this lesson well," he said. "The galaxy is full of powerful beings, stronger, faster, more advanced. But none are more dangerous than the ones who see a game, a challenge." He paused by the door, one hand on the control panel. "Humans aren't monsters," he said. "And war is just another problem waiting to be solved." With that, he stepped out, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence. Smoke hung low in the air, curling up from burning buildings and scorched earth. The color had been washed out over time, but the blood was still obvious. And right in the middle of that chaos, standing on top of a pile of rubble, was a man, a human. His armor was dented, patched with cloth and scavenged plating. His face was streaked with blood and dirt, but it was the eyes that caught everyone off guard. In the still image, even without motion, his eyes seemed alive, burning with a look that made it hard to breathe. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, only fire, rage. "Focus." Professor Luthor let the image linger. "This," he said, stepping slightly aside to avoid blocking the projection, "is Sergeant Elias Grant. He was one of the last human soldiers to participate in a Coalition-sanctioned combat operation before the ban. The classroom. He was dropped into the outskirts of Palvor City with one mission: slow down the Scorn advance. He had no backup, no air support, no reinforcements. The assumption was that he would be dead within hours. And yet," Luthor paused. He let the tension stretch. There was power in silence, and right now, the weight of it hung thick in the air. He killed over 3,000 Scorn warriors. In one night, you could hear the breath suck out of the room. Audible shock. No one even tried to hide it. The Krisha, a species known for its composure, started twitching uncontrollably, writhing in confusion. The Vosk, a massive armored species with a soldier's mindset, actually leaned forward, mouth slightly open. Even the Zealot, normally calm to the point of being unfeeling, shivered. A student in the third row, a Rakash with reptilian features and emerald scales, spoke without raising a hand. "That's not possible." Luthor didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He knew the reaction well. Not even a drone strike. "No," Luthor answered, still staring at the image. "No orbital support. No air-to-ground missiles. He had a crude projectile rifle, half a dozen magazines, and whatever he could build or steal from the ruins." "That's insane," another student whispered. "Is it?" Luthor turned away from the screen and faced the class. "Or is it simply human?" He tapped the console and the lectern again, and the image shifted. What followed was a sequence of stills, captured by old surveillance drones, some coalition recon footage, and a few post-battle recovery scans. Each slide, the bodies of Scorn warriors, enormous, brutal soldiers, standing nearly 9 feet tall, and capable of tearing through steel, with their claws lay in twisted piles. Blood soaked the concrete. Many of them hadn't died from direct combat, but from traps, crude, vicious devices. Spring-loaded metal shards, tripwire-triggered explosives, made from broken power cells, and spike pits dug in alleys and stairwell. "Sergeant Grant didn't try to overpower the Scorn," Luthor said. "He outthought them. He adapted." Another slide showed a Scorn body stuck to a wall, impaled by a sharpened steel rod rebar, most likely launched by what looked like a jury-rigged tension coil system. He found the materials he needed in the ruins of the city vehicles, abandoned homes, shattered machinery, and built an entire death maze. He didn't just resist the Scorn. He turned their assault into a slaughter. A hand went up a Viken student, forearmed, visibly trembling. But how did he know how to build those things? Luthor smiled faintly, but it wasn't a kind smile. "That's the thing about humans," he said. "You don't teach them how to survive. You don't teach them how to win. You give them a reason, and they figure it out on their own." He stepped closer to the class now, walking slowly down the aisle between rows of seats. "They've spent their entire history in conflict. Not just wars with weapons and armies, but against nature, famine, disease, their own civilizations, their own minds. And through it all, they learned how to improvise, how to build under pressure, how to fight without rules. And Sergeant Grant?" He nodded toward the screen. "He was a master of it." No one spoke. Luthor continued. "Grant wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the smartest. He wasn't even the most experienced. But he was desperate. And desperation, when coupled with a human mind, is a force of nature." The projection now showed what had once been a city square. It was now a graveyard. The remains of over 400 Scorn lay scattered. Footage from a thermal scan revealed the layout of explosive charges, salvaged power converters, buried beneath the paving stones. A metal sculpture from the center of the plaza had been modified to act as a directional fragmentation device. The entire square had been rigged, and they walked right into it, Luthor said. He left the central path unguarded, made sure they saw his footprints, then waited. When they rushed in to kill him, he snapped his fingers. Boom! A low murmur went through the class. One student, a pale-skinned Aaron, looked physically ill. 3,000, Luthor repeated softly. That was the total by the time Coalition recovery forces arrived. Not all from traps. Many were shot, slashed, bludgeoned. Some of them bled out after being wounded and left to die slowly. He turned the projection off. There were no survivors. Now he finally looked back at the class again. The mood had changed. "I don't tell you this story to glorify violence," he said. "I tell it because it's the truth, and because it's the reason we banned humans from war." A Zellic in the back raised a translucent tendril. But why just this one man? Wasn't he an anomaly? No. He was a standard infantry sergeant, not even special forces. If anything, he was considered average by human military standards, which is exactly why this is terrifying. Another silence fell across the room. He wasn't a monster, Luthor added. He was a man doing what humans do best when their backs are against the wall, surviving at any cost. Then he stepped back to the lectern, but he didn't activate the display again. "I was on the team that did the recovery," he said suddenly, his voice quieter. "We found his body 2 blocks from the main square, dead, shot through the chest. He bled out, alone, in a bombed-out clinic. He was clutching a bloodied medkit. Must have been trying to save himself." Luthor looked down at his hands. "I remember thinking how small he looked. Just a man. Not a monster. Not a monster. Not a god. The city around him was a crater. Buildings flattened. The Scorn fled in terror. And all of that, from one soldier, one human mind. That's when I understood. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about weapons. It was about what they're willing to do. Humans fight like they've already died once, and decided they're not going out the same way again." He pressed a button and turned off the console completely. The room dimmed as the projector cooled down. "Any species can be trained to fight," he said, voice low, final, "but only one turns war into a test of imagination. And that's why they're banned." Then paused. "I suggest you all reflect on this. Because someday, the Bane may fail." The door slid shut behind him. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The real reason the humans were banned. By the time the next lecture began, word had already spread across the campus. The previous session had shaken everyone. The revelation that a single human one-man could wipe out thousands of Scorn warriors using nothing but his brain and a city's ruins had challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. But what stuck with them even more than the story was the implication that this wasn't an outlier. It wasn't an outlier. It was just what? The usual 40 students had turned into over 100, with dozens standing along the back wall or sitting in the aisle. Even some faculty members had shown up, quietly blending into the shadows like they didn't want anyone to notice how curious or maybe concerned they were. When Professor Luthor stepped into the room, the noise dropped instantly to silence. He didn't smile. He just walked to the front, looked out across the room and said, "You want to know what really scared the Coalition? It wasn't the traps," he continued. "It wasn't the body count. It wasn't even their ability to turn garbage into death machines. What really scared us, what made us start whispering about the Bane, was something far more unsettling." He tapped the panel on the lectern, and the lights dimmed as the holographic projector fired up again. This time, the image was of a jungle dense, humid, and layered with shadows. "This is Cadria 4, Luthor said, "a former Scorn colony. You've probably heard of it. What you don't know is what really happened here." The display zoomed in to show a small squad of human soldiers moving through the underbrush. They were wearing full body armor, visors down, their weapons held with an easy, practiced grip. They moved as one, silent, precise, and with a kind of grace that seemed completely at odds with the chaos they were about to unleash. They were dropped into this jungle with a single objective: delay the Scorn advance until our main forces could regroup. They were outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded on all sides. By every strategic standard we have, it was a suicide mission. Luthor stopped, letting that sink in, but instead of retreating, they attacked. The hologram shifted to footage taken by Scorn recon drones. The human squad had split up, vanishing into the thick jungle like ghosts. When they reappeared, it was always from unexpected angles behind, above, beneath. And every time they did, someone died. The footage showed them springing ambushes, laying traps, dragging wounded Scorn into the trees, and disappearing again. No screens, no signals, just bodies vanishing into darkness. At first, the Scorn commanders assumed they were facing a larger force, but as the days passed, they realized something terrifying. These humans weren't just surviving, they were winning, and more than that. He tapped the screen again. A still image appeared. A human soldier stood over the corpse of a Scorn warrior. His armor was cracked and smeared with blood. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. His rifle was slung over one shoulder, and in his free hand, he held a combat knife still dripping with black scorn blood. But it wasn't the weapon that drew the eye. It was his expression. He was smiling, not just a smirk. It was something raw, something disturbing, Luthor said slowly. The humans weren't just fighting. They were enjoying it. Not in a sadistic way, not cruelty for its own sake, but in a deeper, more primal sense. Like a predator stalking prey. Like a lion in the tall grass. The idea that a sentient species, one with civilization, ethics, culture, could enjoy war was fundamentally alien to them. Luthor's voice was calm, but behind it was a tension, a tremor, like he was trying to keep something buried. They called it the thrill of the hunt, he continued. Not officially, not in their reports, but among themselves, in the quiet moments between engagements. That's what they called it. And that's what they lived for. He pointed to the hologram. For 3 days and nights, they waged a guerrilla campaign, unlike anything the Scorn had ever seen. They lured their enemies into kill zones, used the terrain to their advantage, and never engaged in a direct fight, unless they chose to. Every casualty was calculated. And then, on the 4th day, he said, they vanished. The image shifted again, this time showing what the Scorn found when they tried to retake control of the jungle. Bodies. Dozens. Hundreds. Every squad they sent in had been slaughtered. Some were killed in booby traps. Others were found with their weapons missing, stripped for parts. They left no signal, no beacon, no message. Just silence. Luthor let the image fade. The Scorn, he said, were convinced the humans had gone feral, that they'd lost their minds and turned into something primal, something animal. They began calling the jungle cursed. They pulled out of the colony completely, abandoned the entire planet to avoid further losses. He stepped back, looking around at the students, their faces pale or rippling with unease. That, he said, is how a single human unit, with no reinforcements and no support, liberated an entire world, not through brute force, not through technology, but through terror and something inside them that no other species in the coalition has ever understood. He paused. The love of the hunt. It was a young Zelek, its translucent form trembling slightly. Professor, it said, voice uncertain, how can that be real? Why would any intelligent species enjoy war? Luthor sighed. I've asked myself that for years, he said, and the only answer I found is this. Humans evolved not just with the capacity for violence, but with the capacity to lean into it, to harness it, to find meaning in it. For some of them, conflict sharpens the senses. It gives them purpose, clarity. Another student, a Vosk this time, spoke up. But not all of them are like this. I mean, surely, most humans aren't like the ones you've described. No, Luthor agreed. Most aren't, but the ones who are, the ones who find something beautiful in the chaos of war, those are the ones who end up on the battlefield. He turned the lights back on slowly, and even if they don't go looking for the fight always seems to find them, and when it does, something ancient wakes up. He walked back to the front of the room and turned off the hologram entirely. That's why we banned them. Not because they're savages, but because they are the only species we've ever encountered that can look into the heart of war and smile. No one spoke, no one moved. We thought war was a tragedy, something to be avoided, something to mourn, but for some humans, it's a proving ground, a place where they become who they were always meant to be. He leaned against the edge of the lectern and looked at the students. You wanted to know why the coalition made the ban official. That's why. Ours for them. War is not just about survival. It's about expression. And when we realized that, we were dealing with predators. The silence stretched, deep and uncomfortable. Some students stared blankly. Others stared at the floor. No one raised their hand. Because deep down, they all felt the same cold truth settle over them. The humans didn't just fight because they had to. And that was something no policy, no bane, no treaty would ever be able to undo. By now, the students were used to the rhythm of his lectures, the soft opening, the flicker of the hologram, the slow unraveling of some long-buried truth. He just walked into the auditorium, stood at the front and said, "They thought about exterminating them." You know, the students barely had time to process the sentence. He didn't stop. "I was there," he continued, "not on the battlefield." The Coalition's High War Council convened a summit 2 cycles after the Cadre of 4 incident. Representatives from all major member species attended. The question on the table was simple. Should humanity be wiped out? He walked toward the projector, but didn't activate it yet. His eyes scanned the room instead. "I can see the shock on your faces," he said. "You've all been taught the sanitized version, the moral explanation, that we banned them from warfare because it wasn't fair, because their tech lagged behind, because their bodies were fragile compared to ours. That's the story in your textbooks. That's the version they hand out during diplomatic orientation." He shook his head. "But it's a lie. We didn't ban them out of fairness. We banned them because the alternative was extinction, not theirs." Lecture hall. Not even the rustle of datapods or whispered side comments, just stunned stillness. "After Talvor, after Cadria," Luthor said, his voice more tired than angry, "we realized what we were dealing with. So the discussion turned. Should we allow them to remain in the galaxy at all? Could we afford to?" A hologram activated, showing a large, dimly lit conference room filled with delegates from every major coalition race. Some were recognizable Vosk generals in dark armor, Kree intelligence officers perched on elevated stands, Zelak emissaries shimmering like translucent clouds. But the expressions were the same on every face. Fear. These weren't warmongers, Luthor said. People who'd fought wars. Yes, but who understood the cost of miscalculation. And they were all terrified. The image changed. Charts and diagrams replaced the scene projections, scenarios, simulations. They ran the numbers, considered orbital bombardments, biological agents, surgical strikes, all of it. The plan was to wipe humanity off the galactic map in one coordinated campaign, a species-wide purge. But then someone asked a question that changed everything. What happens if they find out? He let the question linger in the air. See, most species, when faced with annihilation, do one of 3 things: surrender, scatter, or go mad. That's what the projections assumed humanity would do. But the simulations that modeled human psychology told a different story, a darker one. The hologram showed a new slide: case studies, Earth's history, every major human war dating back thousands of years. Every time humans were threatened with extinction from their own kind or some outside force, they adapted, they innovated, and most of all, they fought back harder. He zoomed in on one historical point, an ancient world war. This conflict should have destroyed them, he said. Nuclear weapons, cities in ruin, millions dead. And yet, what did they do after it ended? A pause. They rebuilt, and then they started planning for the next war. He changed the image again, this time to a simulation what would happen if the Coalition attacked Earth first. "We assumed we'd catch them off guard," Luthor said. "Strike fast. Strike hard," but the projections showed something else. Within weeks, they'd reverse engineer our weapons. Within months, they'd retaliate, and not just with brute force. They'd use their minds. Another pause. They wouldn't fight clean. They'd poison our ecosystems, hack our supply chains, weaponize our language, our politics, turn us against each other before they even launched a counterattack. The room was so quiet, you could hear the gentle hum of the projector. "It was then that we realized," Luthor said softly, "that the only thing more dangerous than a human at war is a human with nothing left to lose. They're not like us. Most species, when you push them to the edge, they break. Humans, they sharpen." A Crisa student raised a limb, hesitant. "But how? Why are they like that? Luthor nodded. Good question. It took us a while to understand. The answer lies in their biology and their history. He tapped a command into his datapad, and a new image flickered to life. A human brain highlighted with neural activity scans, historical overlays, trauma response patterns. Their evolutionary path was brutal. Their planet is hostile, their weather unpredictable, their predators numerous. And more than that, their own kind have been their greatest enemies. They were forged in hardship. He zoomed into the amygdala, the brain's fear center. Unlike most species, and when they feel threatened, truly cornered, they undergo what one human psychologist called a combat awakening. It's not magic, it's not supernatural, it's focus. Their adrenaline surges. They stop seeing danger and start seeing opportunity. He changed the slide again. This time it showed footage of a human under fire, pinned behind cover, bleeding from a leg wound. Coalition forces were closing in, but instead of panicking, Luthor narrated. This man activated a radio jammer he built from parts of a broken helmet and a communication node. Then he used his own blood to trigger a heat-based decoy to draw off enemy sensors. The students were stunned. He survived, Luthor added, and took down the pursuing unit with improvised mines he buried the night before. Then slowly, a voice from the back, an RN student, soft bioluminescence, spoke up. So the more you threaten them, the more you threaten them. Exactly. They're like a forest fire. Stamp them out in one place, and they erupt somewhere else stronger, smarter. He stepped back from the projector and leaned on the front desk, arms crossed. That's why the Coalition abandoned the extermination plan. Not out of mercy, not out of diplomacy. Out of fear. Out of fear, you have to understand something. It's not that they can't be beaten in battle. It's that every time you try to beat them, they learn, they come back stronger, and eventually, they don't just survive, they win. Another pause. Then Luthor's voice dropped lower. There's an old Earth saying. I read it in a book once. It said, never corner a wounded animal. At the time, I thought it was poetic. Now, I think it's a warning. He looked straight at the students, now unblinking. Because humanity, when cornered, stops being a civilization. They become a force of nature. The students were silent. Some sat back, processing. Others leaned forward like the gravity of the truth had physically pulled them closer. Luthor turned off the hologram and powered down the lectern. The lights came back up slowly, filling the room with a sterile, almost clinical glow. That's the real reason behind the ban, he said. Because if we ever gave humanity a reason to fight for their very existence, they wouldn't just defend themselves. He glanced toward the exit. They'd burn down the galaxy to make sure no one ever tried again. And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving nothing but silence and the heavy weight of what the Coalition had once dared to consider, and what they had wisely chosen not to do. The room was full. Again. Not just students this time, though there were more of them than ever. Faculty, off-duty security officers, even representatives from local planetary governments had shown up to listen. The word had spread far beyond the university. Something real was happening in that lecture hall. Something terrifying. Something important. His steps were slow, steady, but there was a visible heaviness to them. He stood silently for a moment at the front of the room, letting the anticipation grow thick and heavy. Then, finally, he spoke. Today, he said, we talk about the end. He tapped about the end, the console, and the lights dimmed. This is the planet Kevron. A projection appeared, dusty, gray, barren. Its cracked surface stretched endlessly in every direction, like some broken monument to a world long abandoned. Faint traces of artificial structures dotted the surface, barely visible through the haze of atmosphere. It was once a thriving colony of the Tikal Empire, Luthor said. You may not know much about the Tikal. That's by design. They don't exist anymore. There was a collective pause in the room. Students leaned in. They were ruthless, efficient, technologically unmatched. And they had one goal. Images of battlefields, maps, and casualty reports filled the space. They were winning, he said. The coalition was crumbling. Civilizations wiped out. We were losing. Badly. He turned toward the class, his face hard. So we turned to the only ones who hadn't lost a war. Earth. Blue and green, bright and alive. But the image that followed was nothing like it. The humans agreed to help us, Luthor said, his voice quiet now. But under one condition, that this would be their last war, a final engagement, one and done. The students listened in silence. They didn't send soldiers, Luthor continued. Not at first. Instead, they sent these. He activated a 3D hologram of a towering machine. It stood roughly 3 stories tall, made of angular steel and layered plating. Its limbs looked insect-like, adaptable, modular. Its torso housed an array of weapon ports and heat vents. It was terrifying, and it wasn't even moving. A self-learning war construct, operated remotely, programmed to adapt, analyze, and eliminate. But that's not what scared us, he added. What scared us was the programming directive hardwired into every machine. No surrender, no diplomacy, no quarter. The students didn't speak. Their attention was glued to the projection as it shifted, now showing real footage. Deployment began on day 1, Luthor narrated. Fortresses rained from orbit like steel coffins. They landed with enough force to crack tectonic plates. Each one housed hundreds of these war machines. And from the moment they hit the ground, the world changed. The footage showed what could only be described as industrial horror. The machines didn't just fight. They hunted. Swarms of them moved in coordinated formations, dissecting enemy ranks with mathematical precision. They ignored anything that wasn't a threat. But if it was a threat, or could become one, they destroyed it completely. The Tikal fought back, Luthor said. Of course they did. They launched everything. They had orbital cannons, virus clouds, antimatter warheads. The machines adapted to all of it, upgraded their armor, reconfigured their weapons, changed tactics mid-battle. He turned to face the class again. In less than 72 hours, the Tikal Empire ceased to exist. The image behind him showed the aftermath. A dead planet. No survivors, no structures, no signals. They erased them, down to the last living cell. The horror sank in slowly. There was nothing left to conquer. He continued. No government to negotiate with, no memory to archive. Standing in silence, their job complete. He turned the display off. The room was dark now, save for the soft ceiling lights. That was the moment we realized what we had done. We'd unleashed something beyond our understanding. Beyond our understanding. A hand went up. The voice behind it trembled. What? What happened to the machines? Luthor answered without hesitation. The humans shut them down. Remotely. Every single one. No ceremony, no ceremony, no victory speech. Just off. Like flipping a switch, another student leaned forward. So that was it. The war ended. Yes, Luthor nodded. But the cost was too high. The cost was too high. The coalition had won, but not because we were stronger. We survived because the humans decided we were still useful. That line hit hard. Luthor continued. The vote to ban humans from further participation in galactic conflict passed unanimously. Even Earth agreed to it. Maybe because they knew what they'd created. Or maybe because they knew it was only a matter of time before someone turned on them. The silence in the room was thick now. But what truly haunts us, he said, isn't what they did to the Tikal. He looked each student in the eye. It's how easily they did it. Another hand went up. A young Krike, Professor, did the humans ever use these machines again? Not that we know of. The code was sealed. The protocols dismantled. The hardware destroyed. He let out a breath, but the designs still exist. Somewhere. But we know one thing for certain. They were never meant to be the last. The class sat still, frozen by the implications. Humans, Luthor said, perfected war. Not just battle, not just combat. War. They took it apart and rebuilt it into something pure. Something terrifying. And when we asked them to help us, they showed us what it looks like when you hand a scalpel to a butcher. No one laughed. No one dared to. He stood again, the fatigue in his voice unmistakable. We thought we were desperate. We thought we had no other choice. But in truth, we gave them a canvas, and they painted it with extinction. A Zelek raised a shimmering tendril. Professor, do you believe they'll ever use the machines again? Luthor hesitated. I don't know, he said honestly. But I do know this, if the galaxy ever gives them a reason to bring them back. He looked toward the door. Nothing will be able to stop them. Not again. He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of students too stunned to speak. And in the silence, one terrifying truth settled into their hearts. Humanity had shown them the future of war, and it was a future no one wanted to see again. By the time Professor Luthor entered the lecture hall for the final time, word of his lectures had spread not just across campus or the planet, but into surrounding systems. Journalists tried to get in. Veterans from long-forgotten wars hovered near the back wall. Even representatives from the coalition's military divisions had quietly taken seats among the students, their uniforms hidden under coats or robes. Everyone wanted to hear what Luthor had to say, because today he was going to answer the question that had haunted them all. Luthor didn't say anything at first. He walked to the center of the room, looked around, and let the weight of silence speak for him. Then finally, in a voice worn thin from too many dark memories, he said, "We didn't ban them because they were violent. That would have been easy." He paused. "We didn't ban them because they were savage or cruel. Many species in this galaxy are." Another pause. "We didn't even ban them because they were too good at war." His gaze swept across the packed room. "We banned them because they became war." He turned and activated the holographic display one last time. The image that appeared was simple: a human soldier, young, wounded, eyes hollow, sitting on the edge of a trench, holding a photo in one hand and a bloodied knife in the other. This image, Luthor said, was taken during humanity's last sanctioned war. It wasn't propaganda. It was captured by an allied drone, moments after this man had led a last-ditch assault against a Takal command post. He'd lost half his squad. His legs were broken, but he refused to be evacuated. The room was silent. Killed 19 more enemies before passing out from blood loss. When we found him, he was barely alive, and all he asked for was whether the others had made it. Luthor looked around. "Do you see it now?" In everyone, human forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and still they endured, not always by brute force, but by improvisation. Humans don't just fight with weapons, Luthor said. They fight with memory, with pain, with purpose. He tapped again. A new image appeared, a map of galactic history. Every major war recorded over the last 1,000 years. Patterns of movement, casualty numbers, weapon types. These were acts of transformation. A student in the front finally found her voice. "Professor, if they became war itself, how could they live in peace?" Luthor didn't answer at first. He let the question hang. Then slowly he said, "Because they don't want war. Family, home, love. And they mean it, with every fiber of their being. But if you threaten those things..." Now it showed a simulation, an enemy force threatening a human colony. Then the human changes. Not because they want to, but because they must. He pointed to the center of the map. They become the thing they fear. The monster in the dark, the hand that strikes first. Because to them, survival isn't enough. If something threatens what they love, they don't just survive. They eliminate the threat, completely. The weight of the words lingered like fog. He stepped away from the lectern and began walking slowly through the rows of students. "I've studied war for most of my life," he said. I've studied alien conflict patterns, technological disparities, political motives. I've read volumes of military theory and cultural analysis. He stopped near the middle row, but never have I encountered a species that carries war like a seed in their soul. One that blooms only when it's needed. One that never forgets what it's fighting for. A Vosk cadet stood and asked, "Then what happens if they're provoked again?" "Then God help us all." He returned to the front, and his tone changed softer now. "I want you to understand something," he said. "This isn't a condemnation. I don't hate them. Some of my closest colleagues were human, brave, loyal, brilliant." He paused, voice catching. "I lost one of them during the Tikal campaign. She was a medic, wouldn't carry a weapon. Sickness. But when the camp was hit and everyone else panicked, she dragged 7 wounded soldiers to safety. Then she ran into the fire to help a Tikal child caught in the rubble." He shook his head. "She never came back." He looked at the floor. That's the paradox of humanity. They can be monsters, but they can also be saints. And often, the same person can be both. He met their eyes again, and that's why we had to let them go. A Zealot near the front asked softly, "Let them go?" "Yes," Luthor nodded. "We gave them what they wanted, peace. We banned them from our wars. We stopped calling on them. We asked them to stay home." Another student raised a hand. "But Professor, what if we need them again?" Luthor didn't answer for a. "Do we wake the sleeping beast? Or do we learn to fight like them?" Silence again. And then he said something. "I'm afraid the day may come when we'll have no choice." He turned off the display for good. No more visuals. No more data. Just his voice, quiet and steady. "I've spent my life trying to understand them. And here's what I've learned. The most dangerous human isn't the one holding the biggest gun. It's the one who's already lost everything and still refuses to give up." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many students as he could. "If you remember nothing else from this course, remember this. They are not gods. They are not demons. They are not machines." He paused. "They are us, just a different version, a version shaped by pain and fire and the endless need to prove that they deserve to keep breathing." He took one long breath and then said, "Now, I want to leave you with one final thought. Earth is quiet these days, peaceful. They grow food, build music, write poetry. They raise children and study the stars." He smiled faintly, but make no mistake, buried under their gardens and their cities and their lullabies is the memory of fire. And if they're ever called upon again, if they're ever forced to defend what they love. He looked at them all and said, clearly, but just before he reached the door he stopped. "And if we're lucky," he said over his shoulder, "we'll never have to see it again." Then he walked out, leaving behind a room forever changed. Epilogue. Real-world reflection as the lights came up, and the students sat in stunned silence. Many of them would carry what they'd heard into careers, debates, but even as that fictional lecture ended, the story holds something deeply true for us. Because here on Earth, we know these patterns. We've seen what happens when people are pushed too far, when communities are cornered, when peace is shattered. We've watched as ordinary people, mothers and sons, workers and artists, turn into something else when everything they care about is threatened. And yet, we've also seen humanity at its best, rebuilding after war, forgiving when it seems impossible, choosing mercy over vengeance. The same minds that wage war with terrifying brilliance are also the minds that cure diseases, write symphonies, and hold strangers' hands. Humanity is not one thing, it's both light and shadow. And like the galaxy in the story, we must always ask. Because in the end, the real power of humanity isn't just its capacity for war, it's its capacity to choose peace when peace is still an option.